Today's a special day because I let my father have a bit of a break from preaching. So happy to do that for him. And it's also an honor to be preaching to you here today. And as you know, it's quite a long passage, but usually my sermons are not that long, so you can enjoy the rest of your day with your fathers in this wonderful day. So without further ado, let's get started. Let's get into the sermon. So what is the best gift that you think your father has given to you? So if you're a son and daughter today, think back to your previous childhood memories, if you're a little bit older. And if you're younger today, think about what is it that you want your father to pass down to you? Or if you're a father today, what is it that you want to pass down to your children? Is it a large sum of money, wealth, that you want to pass down? You've got a big bank account. Some of you fathers here today are quiet but have big bank accounts. So is that what you want to pass down to your children? Is it the education? You want to pass down your knowledge, your experience, and maybe you want your kids to go to a good school. You want them to have a great education so they have a good start in life. Or maybe is it the habits of being healthy, hard work, and the characteristics that you developed in your life. Again, your experience you want to pass down. Maybe it's the partner. Maybe you want to give them the right spouse. Maybe you're trying to, a lot of Indonesians are like to... jodohin, that's the word. Thank you. What's that word? So some of you are single. I'm sure your parents have tried to set you up with someone because they want you to have a good partner for the future, because marriage is a one-off thing and you'll be spending the rest of your life with them. So maybe that's the inheritance that they want to pass down to you, to make sure you have the right spouse. So they ask questions to make sure they have all these checklists to make sure they're the right spouse for you. And look, these are all great things that your father would want to pass down to you. Some of these things you want your father to pass down to you. Maybe it's something else that you're thinking of. But these things are good, but they're also meaningless. And why do I say this? Well, let me give you an illustration which me and my father, we visited our grandpa who was sick, I think maybe a month ago, and we visited him once he came back from hospital. And he said and my wife was there also, and he said some really profound things, quite wise things, and we were surprised by how wise he was, especially at his time in age. So he said things that were profound, and he said things such as, everything is meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Even though he worked so hard, and at that age, you look back in your life and you reflect. You reflect a lot more about what you've done in your life. And he said things are meaningless. His hard work, everything was meaningless. Because if there's nothing behind it, then everything you will leave behind. So as you grow older, you realize you lose things in life, and you will eventually leave this earth. You leave everything behind. So everything that you worked so hard for is eventually meaningless if there's nothing that is behind it. And it's very, very wise words. And my grandfather worked very hard in his past, and my dad has shared how hard he's worked, from walking long distances to basically giving half his portion of food to his children, or all of his food actually, when he walked back. How many miles did he walk back? It's a long journey from work to going back, and he's given all his food to his children. He didn't have any of it. So he's come from a hard life, and my dad's also worked very hard to be able to come to Sydney, Australia. Some of you parents here have worked very hard for your children to be able to be here, to go to school here, and to have the life that they have. And we appreciate that. And I hope you kids here appreciate what your fathers and mothers have done for you. So, why do you say these things? Obviously the inheritance will be passed down to your children, right? So it's all, your wealth and everything they work hard, it gets passed down. Obviously your kids are in Sydney now, your kids are going to good school, so, your hard work has done something, right? It's not all for nothing, you might think. And you think here today, you have kids and things like that, you work hard, and hopefully it's not all for nothing, right? But the thing is, all the resources that you give to your children, all the knowledge, experience, wealth, and then all the, if you have a lot of properties, all that, if you give that to your children, they're all good things, but they can also become a curse. So they can be both a blessing and a curse. And why do I say this? Let's look at some famous examples. Some of you might know these people, some of you might not. Some of you might know only one or two. Who knows some of these people? Put your hands up. Anyone know any of these? Any Gabby? Who knows Elvis Presley? Come on. Yeah, that's better. So the top left, that is Elvis Presley's daughter. You can see the resemblance a little bit. Her name is Lisa Marie Presley. So she inherited her father's immense wealth, estate, and obviously that's a good thing, right? You have a famous father, great singer, everyone knows him. But then it created a lot of pressure in her own life, right? So you think it's all good, but she has pressure. What is she going to be when she grows up? So she faced immense pressure in her life, and let's go back to that picture. And she struggled with addiction to financial difficulties and drugs. So even though she got all that amount of wealth or the inheritance, she was still struggling financially. She spent it on things that are not good for her, like drug addiction and other things. So there, she got resources, but the resources wasn't used wisely. Next example, Michael Jackson and his 3 children there on the bottom left-hand corner. So that's Michael Jackson's 3 children. Some of you might know them, Prince, Paris, and Blanket. So they grew up in a unusually sheltered environment. And after their father's death, they faced obviously media and things like that. So they had immense pressure similar to Lisa, and they struggled to live a normal life. And Paris, in particular, the girl in the middle, she struggled about her mental health struggles and past suicide attempts. You see, so you got all that wealth, but the problems are still there. Paris Hilton, bottom right-hand corner. So some of you might know her for being famous. She's a great granddaughter from their father, Conrad Hilton. I bet you don't know who Conrad Hilton is, but you know Paris Hilton, right? Conrad Hilton is the great-grandfather who started the business, the hotel business. And she inherited a great fortune, lived a lavish lifestyle, and she had frequent problems with the law, drug possession, driving under influence, and lots more. So that's another example of wealth without any backing or wisdom on how to use it. The last example is Cameron Douglas, the son of the actor Michael Douglas. He's played a few older movies. So Cameron, again, battled drug addiction, served time in prison for drug-related offences, and again, giving you an example of wealth, ending up in addictive and destructive behaviours rather than being good, rather than being used for good. So blessings and resources could actually be a detriment in life. Even education. You think education might be worthwhile for your kids? Well, yes, you might see some kids becoming successful doctors, lawyers, accountants, but you don't know what is behind all that glamour, all that show, all that wealth that you see. You don't know what problems they have behind it. Maybe they hate their job because, you force them to go in a particular route, they don't like it, and they eventually quit. A lot of doctors have quit their jobs, they don't like their jobs. I know a famous comedian who quit his doctorate degree to become a comedian. I have, other examples of people quitting their long-time careers because they don't like it, but they were forced in that route. And some of them have addictive behaviours to cope with their life that they don't enjoy. So things that are good can become a curse in their children's lives if they're not used wisely. So what is it that we can give to our children? If it's not wealth, inheritance, if it's not resources, a spouse, or if it's not a good education, what is it that we can give to the children? So let's look at the passage now in Genesis 48. We see Abraham's grandson, Jacob. So Jacob is meeting his son Joseph. So Jacob's he's very old, he's about to pass. So Joseph has visited his dad with his two grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim. So Jacob, he blesses the two children. He blesses Joseph through these two children. So how did he bless them? So if you look at the blessing here, does it remind you of another blessing? Do you remember when Isaac blessed who? Jacob, right? Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau. Why was Esau so mad about it? You know, what's with this blessing? Why is it so important? You know, if my dad says, I wish you well, I pray for you, Marian, you have a great future, you think Renungn will be angry about it? Not really, no, right? Because he'll do the same for Ray. So why is it here when Jacob took the blessing from Esau, why is Esau so mad? It's a one-off blessing, isn't it? It's a one-off thing that you can give. So this blessing that he's giving now to the son, Ephraim and Manasseh, it's not just a occasional, I wish you well, have a great future. It's not just a prayer for well-being. It's the actual imparting of the well-being. It's a prophetic vision, a prophetic special divine insight of the children and their future. They can only be given once, at one time. And it was irreversible. So once you give it, you can't take it back. Right? Once he gave it to Jacob, once Isaac gave it to Jacob, Esau can't have it. So that's why it's so important when Jacob has given these to the two children. So all Christians are concerned, right, these days about the spiritual well-being. If you're Christian parents here today, your father, you're obviously concerned about your children's spiritual well-being. You always try to get them to come to church. You always, force them when they were younger, make them to come to church. And obviously you're concerned about their future and their relationship with the Lord. But sometimes you have good intentions, you have obviously the right desire to help them, but sometimes they don't always communicate it in the right way, because we're not perfect, we're human beings. So parents are also human and they make mistakes. So some parents are way too strict on their children. So they're too strict, they force them to do things that they don't want to do, and then when they break a little error, a slight error, they get a big punishment. Big punishment, and the kids are really scared of their parents because their parents are so strict on them. And then there's the other side, where the parents let their kids do whatever they want because they don't want their kids to be affected and their self-esteem to be affected. It's like the Asian way of parenting, which is usually very, very strict. Most Asians are very, very strict. You have to get an A+, 99% ATAR. If not, you're not part of the family anymore. So Asians are very, very strict with, their parenting style. When you compare it to the Western, the kids in the Western do whatever you want. You can do whatever career you want. You don't have to be a lawyer, doctor, accountant. You can do whatever you want in your career and we'll still love you. And then you can see the kids, they just do whatever they want. And so there's two extremes there. Obviously, the Western kids have more self-esteem. They're more, the kids are more upfront. They can do public speaking. They're more brave than some of the Asians. A bit more more quiet, more timid. Maybe they get yelled at by their parents too much for saying the wrong thing. So you can see the two extremes of parenting. Sometimes the kids are too confident, too proud, and the other one's too timid, too scared, because they're scared to do the wrong thing. So, what is the right way? What is God's standard? We have to look at how God disciplines the children. So, God's standards for behavior is obviously both, right? You have to have a balance of consequences for bad behavior, but at the same time to love, to care for your children with tenderness and affection. You can see in Jacob as an example, where he shows that he loves them, tenderly loves them. You can hear the encouraging words by Joseph. He draws near to them, it says in the passage, kisses and embraces them. So there's love there, not just strictness. There's love, there's tenderness, right? And you see in verse 11 that you can see the radiance in his face, and then even though he's got dim eyes, these young men can see the joy, right? And you can see he lays his hands on them, he blesses them through his words, affectionate touch, and later, when these two kids grow up, even though they have the Egyptian culture, they have the heritage, they have the wealth, obviously they come from, who Joseph is and his position. So the kids are very well off with great education and wealth. But later they gave that all up. They gave up all that to become an Israelite, to become God's people again, because of the Father's deep spiritual concern. So fathers here today, take concern not just for your son, but also your grandchildren, as we can see Jacob's example. Secondly, we can give godly heritage by recounting our own experience. So we teach them God's word, but we can also share with them our experience with God. So this assumes that you're walking with God. So I assume all of us here, fathers, you're a Christian or you believe in God. Some of you may not yet believe in God, but take heart and listen, because it's good for your kids also, not just for yourself, but for your future generations. So Jacob walked with God, even though he has ups and downs. He walked with God, and when Joseph came to see him on his deathbed, Jacob recalled all that God has done for him in Bethel. And he appeared for him, he made promises in Bethel, and God was there. And when he saw Joseph's two sons, Jacob expressed his gratitude that God not only allowed him to see only Joseph, but also his children, right? So then he blesses his grandsons. Jacob recounted God's faithfulness and goodness again. So even though Jacob unexpectedly, obviously the older children would have the inheritance back in that day, so he switched his hand. It's all right. So Joseph put Manasseh on the right, Ephraim on the left, but Joseph switched his hands. And this gives an example of his own experience. Obviously, Esau was the firstborn, and Jacob was the second. Remember? So then Jacob was the one that got the inheritance, even though he was the second child. So he's giving his experience. He's doing the same thing. Now the younger child has the blessing of the older child. So it's showing his previous experience. So these are the other three examples that we can learn from imparting our experience to God, to our children and our grandchildren. So we can tell of God's covenant faithfulness towards you. So God has been faithful to all of us, and we can see here Jacob has given testimony. So before, if you read the previous chapter in chapter 47, I know you haven't, or maybe you've read that a long time ago, but previously Jacob has complained to Pharaoh in verse 49. Few and unpleasant have been the years of my life. But now in chapter 48, Jacob has, mellowed. He's now giving an example of telling his kids about the wonderful experience of God's faithfulness. So it's an opposite thing. He was complaining in chapter 47. Now he's giving thanks to God about God's faithfulness. So an example of that is in Bethel. So God appeared to him in Bethel as he fled from his brother, because he took the inheritance from Esau. So he ran. And God appeared to him in Bethel and comforted him. And God would have been just in using somebody else instead of Jacob. But God still reassured him, even though he took the the blessing from Esau. But even then, even though Jacob did that, God still reassures him that he has the promises that's coming to him. 20 years later, Jacob wasn't much further along. He had a business dealing with Laban back in Canaan. So he settled outside of the land in Canaan. Once he took the money from Laban, if you know that story, he went to another land, and then after that, his sons, in that town, has murdered and killed the whole town because the town one of the men has raped the sister. So this is all because Jacob didn't seek God's guidance. He went on his own way, and he went to this town without God's wisdom. But God appeared a second time to Jacob and assured him that the promises were still good. So assured Jacob that still the promises are with him. So and the next one, even in Jacob's great time of sorrow, when Rachel died, God's comfort has been there too. So Jacob has experienced a lot of losses, a lot of failures, but even through all of that, God is still there, and he's showing that, he's telling that to his grandsons. So an example of that is Rachel's loss. Also, the last one was Joseph. So Joseph, we thought, died. Remember when Joseph was sold to slavery? So Jacob thought that Joseph has died. But then God again has given him not just Joseph, but Joseph's 2 grandsons, and he's alive and well. So when your family looks at your own life, now let's go back to our own lives today. When your children look at you today, what do they see? Do they say, oh, God is very faithful in my life. God has done this for me. God has stayed true to his word. Or would they say, oh, looks like God's not very good, is he? I mean, my parents are not happy. They're always lacking in something. They're always complaining. What does your children see in your life? Is God faithful in your life? Or are you complaining about, things that God has not yet done? So kids are smarter than you might think. They can see not just from your words, but they can see from your life and your actions, whether God is faithful in your life, or that you think that God is not, even though he is. So they see that, and that either drives them towards him or it drives them away. So we have to show that God is faithful, not just by our words, not just by what we say, but also the way we live our lives and our attitudes towards God, even through the hard times. So Jacob's life was not always smooth, but even though he's not smooth, he's always been faithful, and he's always telling his kids that God is faithful, even in these hard times. Secondly, we tell them of God's great salvation. So the next thing is that Jacob is sharing that God has saved him multiple times. Obviously, Jesus has not yet come yet, so he's giving you an example of God's salvation in a different way, in his redemption from Laban, from Esau, from a few things. And one particular example is in verses 16. Jacob calls God the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. He was probably thinking at this point about his experience in Mahanaim. Is that the city? Mahanaim? It's hard to say. So the angels camped around him and protected him from Laban. So angels, protected him from Laban's aggression when they were chasing after him, and the angels wrestled with him at Peniel just before he met with Esau. So he feared his reunion, and then he wrestled with God, if you remember that verse. So he equates this angel of God, he equates it as, the angel of God as being Jesus Christ. The word redeemed in this, especially Hebrew word, was not just, a normal word that we use it today, but redeemed in Hebrew is a special word, which means that the relative, the closest cousin or closest relative, can help a certain person out of bondage. So if you owe money and you can't pay it off, you have to sell your property, you have to sell yourself to slavery. This relative can save you, can pay for you. So they can sell something and then they can use the money to redeem you. So that's the word what it's used for. That's what redeemed means in Hebrew. So this is what the word that Jacob used in this passage, that the angel who has redeemed me from all evil. So this is a foresight of what picture of what God did for us in Christ. So we were enslaved to sin with no way to free ourselves. So the price was more than we can afford. So we sin, we cannot save ourselves, we can't afford it. And that's why Christ has been sent by God as our Redeemer and had paid in His own blood. So this is the story of salvation that you pass down to your kids. Not just the story of your own experience, but also the story of Jesus Christ, who has saved you, and how that has impacted your life. And lastly, is to tell them of God's amazing grace. So not just about the salvation, but about the grace that God has given. What's the difference? Right, there's salvation, there's grace, there's the inheritance that we just learned about. So the third one is the grace that we can share to our children. So in blessing his grandsons, Jacob deliberately crossed his hands, right, as I said before, so that his right hand is on Ephraim, which is the younger, instead of Manasseh, the older. And Joseph tried to correct it. No, Joseph said, no, this is wrong. This is the older one, so the right hand should be on the older one. But Jacob knows. He said, I know, my son, I know. Because God has a special revelation to Jacob that Ephraim would take prominence over Manasseh, over the tribes of Israel. So Jacob knew that eventually the younger one would have a bigger population, a bigger economy, a stronger country over Manasseh. Even though over hundreds of years Manasseh was stronger. So actually Manasseh was stronger for a few hundred years. Even in Moses' day, Manasseh still outnumbered Ephraim, more than 20,000 people in numbers. But Moses shows his faith in recording this prophecy, which wasn't yet fulfilled. But Ephraim eventually did grow larger. So Ephraim eventually got stronger and became more larger than Manasseh itself. And then again, fulfilling God's prophecy and Jacob's prophecy. Is there a reason why Jacob did this? Is there a reason why he switched the hands? There isn't any reason. There's no human reason why he did that. Because normally you would choose the older, the stronger one, right? To handle the inheritance, handle the blessing, so they can look after the younger one, which is what humans would think. The older one has responsibility because they're stronger, they're older. But Jacob here was illustrating a divine principle which he had learned. That God blesses us not from our strength, not from our wisdom, or from any merit, or any of our talents. But he picked someone that he picks, not because he qualifies, but it's God's own divine principle, his choice. They can pick anyone and change them. So the world would have picked Ishmael instead of Ishmael instead of Isaac. And the world would have picked Esau instead of Jacob, because Esau was the outdoor guy, Jacob he likes to be indoors. And the world would have picked the older one, Manasseh, instead of Ephraim. That's how the world would think. But God doesn't work like that. God doesn't choose the most gifted, intelligent, upright. But God chooses the one He chooses to show us it's not from our own doing or our own merit, but God's power to shame the wisdom of this world, so that no one can boast before God. 1 Corinthians 1:26-31. So here, Manasseh, the older one, could have just said, hey, it's not fair. Why does the younger one get first place instead of me? I'm the older one, I deserve this. But if he said that, he would have missed God's grace for his life. Because God, again, doesn't work on merit or your skills or your talents, but based on God's sovereign choice. So we as human beings, we have no right to say to our Creator, why have you made me like this? So the clay has no right to tell the potter, the one that made the clay, why have you made me like this? If God gave us what we deserve, where do we all deserve to be? If God gave us exactly what we deserve, where do we deserve to be? Going to hell. Because we all have sinned. So if God gave us what we deserve, we wouldn't like it, right? We would go to hell. So God doesn't give us what we deserve. God gives us grace. God gives us more than we deserve. So we need to learn to humble ourselves before the sovereign God and be grateful for His grace, rather than be grumbling and say, oh, someone else has more than me. He's got a better car than me. Why does he have more children? Why are his children smarter, than my children? So we can't grumble to God about these things. We learn to be humble and then thank God that we have children. We live in Australia. We have what we need. So that we can impart a godly heritage. We can impart the example, right? Well, not just by our words, but our example to our children and our grandchildren. And taking the spiritual concern for them by our own experiences. So lastly, we give godly heritage by picturing the right kind of hope to our children and our grandchildren. What is it that you hope for your kids? I'm sure you all have hopes and dreams for what your children should be. What is it that you hope for your kids? So in this example, you see the two grandsons are living in Egypt. They have the best schools, the best education, the best property. They're in a wealthy city. The Egyptians back then were a wealthy city, a wealthy nation. The best kind of education and things that you can get. So UNSW, UCID, UTS, all that. That's in Egypt. It's equivalent to Egypt. It's the best schools that you can get. Harvard, all the unis that you can think of. So Egypt was a very high technology high technological nation. Or they're very advanced in their years. So it would be natural for Jacob to wish that they stayed there, that they had a great education, that they lived a good life. So it's natural for Jacob to wish good things for their children, in which Egypt has. All the opportunities of power, privilege, and prestige. And the mother would also be thinking the same thing. The mother is obviously an Egyptian. She's from there. She would wonder, why would, my sons be taken out from where it is? We live in the best country, the best education, and have access to all the networks, the high political power. Why are the kids going to this poorer nation, this weaker nation? You're throwing away your career in Egypt for what? So it's like your son is going to become a surgeon, right? And he decides to go to a different country to serve the poor people, to serve the third world country for free. What would you say to them? If your son's going to become a surgeon one day, they already finished their degree, and they decided to go to a third world country to help the people that can't afford the medical care. So this is what it's like when Joseph is going to Jacob for the future of their children. So then Jacob paints a picture of Joseph's future in the Lord. He says, I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers, and I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. So it would have been easy at this time for Jacob to say, son, I'm proud of you and your success in Egypt. Do you remember Joseph? He's second in charge of the whole nation. Imagine the access he has to power. He would have just said, oh, I'm proud of your success in Egypt, and just leave it at that. Because if your son was a vice president, that's as high as it can get. What else would you want more for your children, right? If it's a vice president. So Jacob could have just ended it right there. But Jacob helped Joseph to see what God wanted for him and his children. And that is mainly to return to the promised land. You can see that in the verse. So Jacob didn't actually want them to stay in Egypt. He wanted them to return to the promised land. Even though he has all that power, all that access to everything, Jacob still wanted his grandchildren to return to where they came from. So the point is, Jacob pictured a great future in the Lord for his children and his grandchildren. A future that involved the fulfillment of God's promises. So as God's people in our day, what is it that we want for our children? You want your children to become the president? You want your children to become surgeons? These are all great things. But what is it that we learned in this passage? So as God's people, our children's great purpose is to complete the task that God has set before us, to evangelize to other people about the salvation that Christ has given to us. To complete the task of being God's people, we do not truly bless our children if we encourage them only on worldly success. Obviously that's good to have resources in this world to be successful. You can be an example to others. But we do not truly bless our children if that's all we want. Do you remember all the examples that I showed you with those 4 children? They had all their wealth, inheritance, but they were still not there. They still had problems. They were worse off, actually, because of the blessings, the resources that they were given. So it's not just that we want to bless our children with, but by the godly inheritance, as we learn in the Bible. So let me balance that by saying that, when we learn about Joseph, obviously he had plans for Manasseh and Ephraim. We have to be careful also not to determine our children to follow a certain career path. Right? So here we see Jacob giving the blessing to Ephraim, but originally Joseph wanted Manasseh to receive the blessing of the firstborn. So you can see God's plan can be different to what your plans are for your children. Maybe you want your children to be a certain someone, a certain something, but maybe God's plan is different. So we need to encourage our kids to follow the Lord with all their heart, but at the same time realize that the Lord may not want them to be what we want them to be. So just like the spiritual fathers before us, I want to conclude that my grandfather and my father has passed down the godly heritage, the inheritance of salvation of Jesus Christ, and thank the Lord also that He has given us this blessing through the generations of my father and my grandfather. So this will be passed down to our future generations. So if you're a son and daughter today, and your parents have forced you before to go to church, to go to Sunday school, thank them, because in the future, and when you pass down these things to your kids, just remember of what your parents have given to you. Thank them today for this eternal gift of salvation, the promises of God and salvation. And most of all, we have to thank our first Father, the Father that created all this from the very beginning, our Heavenly Father, before the world began. And that He has given us His Son, Jesus Christ, and brought us back to Him. So let's pray.